To the old lady who still won't let go of Dad's money, my son Daniel said, raising his wine glass on the night of my 86th birthday, and the room filled with a strange kind of laughter that sounded polite but felt cold. For a moment no one looked at me directly. Some of the guests studied their plates, others pretended to sip their drinks, and a few forced smiles that never reached their eyes. I sat at the head of the long dining table in a private room of a quiet restaurant overlooking the harbor, the kind of place Daniel insisted would be perfect for celebrating such a milestone. The candles on the cake flickered softly, reflecting in the tall windows behind us where the lights of the marina shimmered on dark water. I remember thinking how beautiful the evening looked from the outside, the white tablecloths, the polished silverware, the soft music drifting from somewhere in the dining room. It looked like a celebration, but it didn't feel like one anymore. Daniel swayed slightly as he stood there with his glass raised, the faint smell of whiskey drifting across the table. My daughter-in-law Rachel sat beside him with a tight smile on her face, the kind that appears supportive but carries a trace of impatience. "Come on, Mom," Daniel added with a laugh that was louder than necessary. "It's just a joke. Everyone knows you're the only thing standing between us and Dad's estate." A few people chuckled again, though this time it sounded even more uncomfortable. I felt Emily's hand gently touch my arm under the table. My granddaughter had been quiet all evening, watching everything with those thoughtful eyes of hers that reminded me so much of her grandfather. I slowly set down my fork and folded my hands in my lap. At 86 years old, I had learned that silence often says more than any argument ever could. The birthday cake sat in the center of the table, chocolate with simple white frosting. Rachel had arranged for the restaurant to bring it out earlier with a cheerful little song, but the moment had passed quickly, replaced by Daniel's speech and the uneasy mood that followed it. The candles were still burning now, their wax slowly bending toward the frosting. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and tried to. Remember the boy who used to run across our backyard chasing fireflies in the summer? The boy who once saved his allowance for weeks to buy me a small blue scarf from a gift shop near the beach. That boy seemed very far away tonight. Daniel lowered his glass and took a long sip, clearly pleased with himself. "Seriously though," he said, leaning back into his chair, "Dad worked his whole life for that money. It should be helping the family now, not just sitting there while you hold on to everything." Rachel nodded slightly beside him. She didn't say anything, but the look she gave him suggested this conversation had been rehearsed before tonight. I glanced around the table at the rest of our relatives, cousins, and neighbors who had come thinking they were attending a birthday dinner. None of them expected to witness a family dispute disguised as a toast. I picked up my water glass and took a small sip. The coolness steadied me. "Thank you for the toast, Daniel," I said calmly. My voice sounded softer than the clinking glasses around us, but the table grew quiet as soon as I spoke. It's always interesting to hear what people choose to celebrate. Rachel shifted in her seat. Daniel frowned slightly, as if my response hadn't gone the way he expected. Across from me, Emily watched silently, her brows drawn together in concern. I noticed how carefully she studied every expression around the table, as though trying to understand something important about the people she loved. I turned my gaze back to the harbor lights beyond the window. The water moved slowly beneath the docks, steady and patient. For the rest of the evening, the conversation returned to safer topics: weather, travel plans, a neighbor's new boat. But the earlier words lingered in the air like the faint echo of a bell. Daniel laughed louder than anyone else. Rachel kept refilling his wine glass, and the candles on my cake finally burned down to small pools of wax. No one noticed when I quietly leaned forward and blew them out. I remained seated for a moment after the candles went out, watching the thin trail of smoke curl upward before disappearing into the soft light above the table. No one said anything about the wish that people usually ask for when someone blows out birthday candles. At 86 years old, perhaps people assume you have already made all the wishes you can. The waiter appeared quietly to begin clearing the dessert plates, his movements careful and professional, as if he sensed the fragile mood around our table. Daniel leaned back in his chair, swirling the last of his wine and talking loudly about the harbor view as though nothing unusual had happened. Rachel nodded along beside him, occasionally glancing at me with an expression that seemed half polite and half impatient. It was the look of someone waiting for a moment to arrive. Emily squeezed my hand once more before letting go. Her eyes followed Daniel for a second, then returned to me with quiet concern. I gave her a small smile so she would not worry. The rest of the dinner moved slowly after that. Conversations drifted from one topic to another without much enthusiasm. Someone mentioned the weather forecast for the weekend. Another relative asked about a new restaurant downtown. The polite noise of small talk filled the room, but underneath it all there was a silence that none of them could quite erase. When the bill arrived, Daniel reached for it immediately with a theatrical gesture. "Tonight is on me," he announced. "It is the least I can do for Mom's big day." The words sounded generous, but the tone behind them carried something else, something performative. Rachel placed her hand lightly on his arm, as if encouraging the moment. I noticed how quickly Daniel signed the receipt without even looking at the total. Success had been good to him over the years, at least on the surface. Expensive watches, new cars every few years, vacations to places with bright beaches and warm oceans. The kind of life people admire from the outside. Yet tonight his laughter felt forced, and there was a tightness in his eyes that had not been there when he was younger. When we finally stood to leave, the restaurant staff thanked us warmly and wished me a happy birthday. Outside, the night air was cool and carried the faint scent of salt from the harbor. The marina lights stretched across the dark water like a long ribbon of gold. Daniel clapped me gently on the shoulder as if the earlier toast had been harmless fun. "You know I was kidding back there," he said. "Everybody knows you are tough." "Mom." I looked at him calmly. "Yes, Daniel," I replied. "I suppose they do." Rachel stepped forward with her practiced smile. "We should all get together soon and talk about some practical things," she said carefully. "You know, the house, the property, long-term plans. It would make everything easier for everyone." The word everyone lingered in the air for a moment. I nodded slowly as if considering the idea. Emily stood beside me quietly, her coat wrapped tightly against the evening breeze. As the others walked toward the parking lot, she remained near me, watching their silhouettes move beneath the streetlights. "Grandma," she said softly, "that toast was not right." I touched her hand gently. "Sometimes people reveal more than they intend," I said. She looked toward the harbor and then back at me. "Are you going to do anything about it?" I turned my gaze to the water again. The tide was moving steadily now, carrying small ripples toward the open bay. "Oh, Emily," I said after a moment, my voice calm and thoughtful. "Your grandfather always believed that patience was the most powerful tool a person could have." She studied my face, perhaps searching for something in my expression. I simply smiled and began walking toward my car. Behind us, the restaurant lights glowed warmly against the quiet night, and the echo of Daniel's toast lingered in my memory like a line from a speech that had been spoken too soon. I did not drive home right away that night. Instead, I sat in my car for several minutes in the quiet parking lot overlooking the harbor, watching the slow movement of the water beneath the docks. The marina lights reflected across the surface like long ribbons of gold, stretching and bending with every small wave. At 86 years old, I have learned that moments like this matter more than people realize. Silence has a way of organizing thoughts that feel scattered during the noise of a crowded room. Daniel's words replayed in my mind with surprising clarity. "To the old lady who will not let go of Dad's money." He had tried to make it sound like a joke, but jokes often reveal the truth people are too careful to say directly. I rested my hands on the steering wheel and remembered another evening many years ago when this same harbor looked very different. My husband George and I had stood here together one summer night, nearly 30 years earlier after buying the lake house that Daniel now spoke about so casually. George had been proud that evening, not because of the house itself, but because of what it represented. We had built our life slowly, carefully, dollar by dollar, through years of work that began long before Daniel was born. George believed deeply that family should benefit from that work, but he also believed something else just as strongly. Respect must come before inheritance. I could still hear his voice from the afternoon when he first mentioned the idea to me. We were sitting in the kitchen of our home while sunlight came through the window above the sink. George placed his coffee cup on the table and looked at me in that thoughtful way he had whenever he was planning something important. "Margaret," he said quietly, "promise me something. If the day ever comes when someone treats you like a problem instead of family, do not reward that behavior." I remember laughing at the time because the idea seemed impossible. Daniel had been a responsible young man then, full of energy and plans for the future. But George only smiled and shook his head gently, as if he understood something about time that I had not yet learned. Later that same year, he visited Harold Benson, the attorney who had handled our paperwork for decades. I had gone with him to the office downtown, a small building with tall windows and shelves full of neatly organized files. Harold had listened carefully while George explained a few adjustments he wanted made to the estate documents. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would attract attention, just a quiet clause placed among many ordinary pages. George told me afterward that legal protection was like insurance. You hope it never becomes necessary, but you prepare for the possibility anyway. Sitting there in the dark parking lot now, I realized how much patience George must have expected from me. The night air outside my car carried the cool scent of the ocean, and somewhere in the distance a boat engine hummed softly across the water. I finally started the engine and drove home along the quiet road that followed the shoreline. My house stood on a gentle hill overlooking the same harbor that George loved so much. The porch light glowed warmly as I pulled into the driveway, and the familiar shape of the front garden appeared in the headlights. Inside, the house was still and peaceful. I placed my coat on the hook near the door and walked slowly into the living room where a framed photograph of George rested on the mantel. He looked exactly as I remembered him from that summer by the harbor, calm and confident, as if time itself had paused inside the picture. I studied the photograph for a long moment before speaking quietly to the empty room. Daniel believes this is about money, I said softly, but you and I both know it was never about that. Outside the windows, the harbor lights shimmered faintly through the darkness, steady and patient, just like the tide that never rushed yet always arrived exactly where it was meant to be. The next morning the house was quiet in the way it often is after a long day, filled with people and noise. Sunlight moved slowly across the kitchen floor, stretching through the window above the sink just as it had for decades. I woke earlier than usual, though age has a way of doing that. At 86 years old, the body no longer believes in sleeping late. I made my coffee the same way I always had, measuring the grounds carefully and letting the machine hum softly while the aroma filled the room. Outside the window, the harbor looked calm beneath a pale morning sky. A few small boats moved slowly across the water, their engines faint in the distance. For a moment, everything felt peaceful, almost ordinary, as if the previous evening had been nothing more than a strange dream. I carried my coffee into the living room and sat in the chair George used to favor. The cushions had softened over the years, but still held their shape, much like the routines that had defined our life together. On the small table beside the chair rested a wooden box where I kept a few important papers and letters. George had placed that box there himself many years ago, saying it was better to keep meaningful things where you could reach them easily. I opened the lid slowly and looked through the familiar contents. Old photographs, a few handwritten notes from holidays long past, and beneath them a sealed envelope with Harold Benson's careful handwriting across the front. I had not opened it in years because there had never been a reason to. George believed preparation was quiet work. You put the pieces in place long before anyone realizes they exist. As I held the envelope in my hands, I remembered another conversation with him from the last autumn we spent together. We had been sitting on the porch watching the leaves turn along the hillside while the late afternoon sun warmed the wooden steps. George had been unusually thoughtful that day, speaking slowly as if weighing every word. "Margaret," he said, "families sometimes change in ways we do not expect. Success can be a blessing, but it can also make people forget where they started." I told him Daniel was doing well and that we should be proud of him. George smiled gently at that and nodded, but he continued speaking. "Pride is good," he said, "but responsibility must come with it. What we built together was never meant to become a reward for impatience or entitlement." I had listened quietly because George rarely spoke so directly about the future. He explained that Harold had helped him include a provision in our estate documents that would only matter if someone forgot the difference between family and opportunity. I remember asking if such a precaution was really necessary. George only looked toward the harbor for a long moment before answering. "Perhaps it will never matter," he said, "but if the day ever comes when respect disappears, the truth should still have somewhere to stand." Sitting in the living room now with the envelope resting on my lap, I realized that George had not been preparing for conflict. He had been protecting balance. Outside, the morning sunlight moved higher across the water, and the steady rhythm of the tide continued exactly as it had the night before. I placed the envelope back into the box and closed the lid gently. There was still time before anything needed to happen. Patience, after all, was the one lesson George repeated more often than any other. And patience has a quiet way of revealing exactly who people become when they believe no one is watching. Later that afternoon, the house was still quiet, but the kind of quiet that makes small sounds feel sharper than usual. I was in the kitchen rinsing my coffee cup when I heard a car pull slowly into the driveway. Through the window above the sink, I saw Emily step out of her car, her dark hair moving slightly in the afternoon breeze as she walked toward the front door. I dried my hands and opened the door before she even knocked. She looked a little uncertain, as though she had been thinking carefully about whether to come. "I hope I am not interrupting anything," she said softly. I was nearby and thought I would stop by. I smiled and stepped aside so she could come in. "You never need an excuse to visit," I told her. Emily had always been different from the rest of the family. Thoughtful where others were impatient. Observant in ways that reminded me of George. She followed me into the kitchen where the afternoon sunlight stretched across the table. I offered her a cup of tea and she nodded, settling into the chair across from me. For a few moments neither of us spoke. The kettle hummed quietly on the stove while the clock above the doorway ticked in its steady rhythm. Finally, Emily looked down at the table and folded her hands together. "Grandma," she said gently, "about last night." I poured the hot water into 2 cups and placed one in front of her. "There is no need to apologize for something you did not say," I replied. She shook her head slightly. "I know, but it still felt wrong to sit there and pretend everything was fine." Her voice carried the kind of honesty that many people lose as they grow older. I sat down across from her and stirred my tea slowly. "Sometimes pretending keeps the peace long enough for the truth to appear," I said. Emily studied my face for a moment, as if she was trying to understand something deeper behind my words. Then she leaned forward slightly. "Dad has been acting strange for months," she admitted. "More stressed than usual. Mom keeps talking about investments and property values. They argue about money when they think no one can hear." I listened without interrupting. The pieces she described did not surprise me, but hearing them spoken aloud made the pattern clearer. Emily continued carefully. "A few weeks ago, I heard Mom telling someone on the phone that the lake house would solve everything once it was sold. She said it like the decision had already been made." I set my spoon down quietly. Outside the kitchen window, a small fishing boat moved across the harbor, its wake spreading slowly behind it. "Did your father know you heard that conversation?" I asked. Emily shook her head. "No, I do not think he realized I was home." She hesitated before speaking again. "Grandma, are they trying to make you sell the property?" Her question hung gently in the air between us. I looked around the kitchen for a moment, noticing the familiar details that had surrounded our family for years. The wooden table George had built by hand. The small calendar on the wall where I still marked important days with a pencil. Finally, I met Emily's eyes again. "It seems they believe that might happen soon," I said calmly. Emily leaned back in her chair, absorbing the answer. "But you are not planning to sell it, are you?" she asked. I allowed myself a small smile. "Your grandfather used to say that important decisions should never be rushed by someone else's impatience," I replied. Emily watched me quietly for another moment before nodding. "I always liked the way Grandpa thought about things," she said. I reached across the table and gently touched her hand. "So did I answered. Outside, the afternoon light continued drifting slowly across the harbor, and somewhere in the distance the faint sound of a boat horn echoed across the water like a quiet reminder that time, like the tide, moves forward whether people are ready for it or not. After Emily left that afternoon, the house returned to its quiet rhythm, but the silence felt different now, as if something important had begun moving beneath the surface. I washed the teacups slowly and placed them back in the cabinet where they had rested for years. Outside the window, the light was beginning to soften, turning the water in the harbor into a deep shade of blue that always reminded me of early evening walks George and I used to take along the shoreline. I stood there for a moment thinking about Emily's words and the way she had spoken them, carefully but honestly. Young people often notice things long before older ones admit them. When the kitchen was finally clean, I walked into the living room and picked up the telephone that sat on the small table beside George's chair. The number was one I had known for decades. Harold Benson had handled nearly every legal document our family ever signed. His office was only a few blocks from the courthouse downtown, in the same brick building where George and I had visited so many years earlier. The phone rang twice before Harold answered in his calm, familiar voice. "Margaret, it is good to hear from you," he said warmly. "I was thinking about calling to wish you a happy birthday." I thanked him and told him the dinner had been memorable, which made him laugh softly in the polite way lawyers do when they suspect there is more to the story. "Harold," I said after a moment, "I believe it might be time for us to review some old documents." There was a brief pause on the line before he answered. "Of course," he said carefully. "Would tomorrow morning work for you?" I looked out toward the harbor again, where the last sunlight was beginning to fade behind the hills. "Yes," I replied. "Tomorrow morning will be perfect." The next day the drive into town felt familiar in a comforting way. The road followed the shoreline for several miles before turning toward the courthouse square where Harold's office stood. Downtown had not changed very much over the years. The same bakery on the corner still displayed fresh bread in its front window. The small bookstore across the street still had the wooden sign George liked so much. I parked near the sidewalk and walked slowly toward the building, enjoying the crisp morning air. Harold greeted me at the door of his office with the same steady professionalism I remembered. His hair was grayer now, but his posture remained straight and confident. "Margaret, please come in," he said, guiding me into the conference room where sunlight poured through tall windows. A neat stack of folders already waited on the polished table. I sat down while Harold opened one of the files and adjusted his glasses. "I believe I know why you have come," he said gently. I folded my hands together and looked at the familiar pages spread before us. "George trusted you to prepare everything carefully," I said. Harold nodded once. "He did, and he was very clear about his intentions." For a few moments we reviewed the documents quietly. There were several pages outlining the estate, the lake house, the investments, and the family trust George had created many years earlier. Then Harold turned to a section near the back of the file and placed his finger beside a paragraph written in careful legal language. "This is the clause George insisted on adding," he explained. "It activates only if certain conditions are met." I read the paragraph slowly, remembering the afternoon George had spoken about responsibility and respect. The words were simple but precise. If any heir attempted to pressure, humiliate, or manipulate Margaret Whitmore in order to gain control of the estate, their inheritance would immediately be redirected to another beneficiary chosen by Margaret herself. I closed the folder gently and looked up at Harold. "Everything is still exactly as George wanted?" I asked. Harold nodded. "Nothing has changed." Outside the tall windows, the town moved through its ordinary morning routine. People walking along the sidewalks, cars passing slowly through the intersection. Life continued as it always did. I placed my hand lightly on the folder and smiled in a quiet, thoughtful way. "Good," I said calmly. "Then I believe the time has come for the family to have another dinner together." 2 days later I made the calls. I did not rush them, and I did not explain very much. I simply told Daniel and Rachel that I would like the family to come to my house for dinner on Sunday evening. My voice remained calm, the same tone I had used for years whenever I invited people for holidays or birthdays. Daniel sounded surprised at first, but I could hear something else beneath the surprise. "Interest." "Sure, Mom," he said quickly. "That sounds nice. We can talk about a few things while we are there." Rachel's voice appeared faintly in the background, asking him what I had said. He repeated my invitation to her, and I heard a quiet murmur of approval before he returned to the phone. "We will be there," he assured me. After I hung up, I placed the phone back on the small table beside George's chair and looked around the living room. The afternoon sunlight rested gently across the wooden floor, and the quiet house felt steady and familiar. Preparing dinner for family had once been one of my favorite traditions. George used to say that a good meal could bring people back to themselves, reminding them of who they were before the noise of the world made everything complicated. I moved slowly through the kitchen, taking out the same dishes we had used for years. The white plates with the thin blue border. The silverware George polished every holiday morning. There was nothing extravagant about the table, but it carried the quiet dignity of routine. Later that evening Emily called. Her voice sounded curious but cautious. "Dad told me you invited everyone over on Sunday," she said. "Yes," I answered simply. "I thought it might be time for another family dinner." She hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Do you want me to come too?" I smiled even though she could not see it. Of course, I said. You are always welcome here. Sunday arrived with clear skies and a cool breeze moving across the harbor. By late afternoon, the house smelled of roasted vegetables and fresh bread warming in the oven. I set the table carefully, placing each glass and plate in its familiar position. Outside the kitchen window, the water moved quietly beneath the fading sunlight, just as it had the night of my birthday dinner. At exactly 6 o'clock, a car door closed in the driveway. Daniel and Rachel stepped onto the porch a moment later, their voices drifting through the open window as they walked toward the front door. Daniel knocked twice in a casual rhythm he had used since he was a boy. When I opened the door, he greeted me with a bright smile that seemed almost too cheerful. "Mom, the place smells wonderful," he said as he stepped inside. Rachel followed behind him carrying a bottle of wine and wearing the same polite expression she used whenever she was preparing for a conversation she believed would go her way. "It is so nice of you to host dinner again," she added warmly. I thanked them and led them into the dining room where the table was already prepared. Daniel glanced around the room, taking in the familiar furniture and the framed photographs along the walls. "It feels like old times," he said with a small laugh. Rachel set the wine bottle on the table and smoothed the front of her jacket as she sat down. A few minutes later, Emily arrived quietly and joined us, greeting everyone with the gentle calm she always carried. The four of us settled around the table while the evening light faded slowly outside the windows. For a short while the conversation remained ordinary. Daniel spoke about work. Rachel mentioned rising property prices along the lake. Emily listened quietly, her eyes occasionally moving toward me as if waiting for something she could sense but had not yet seen. Finally, Daniel leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together with a confident smile. "So, Mom," he said carefully, "you mentioned wanting to talk about something important tonight." I looked around the table for a moment before answering. The room was quiet except for the soft ticking of the clock in the hallway. "Yes," I said calmly. "I believe it is time we discuss the future of your father's estate." Daniel's smile widened the moment I mentioned the estate, as if the conversation he had been waiting for had finally arrived. Rachel leaned forward slightly in her chair, her fingers resting neatly around her wine glass, her posture attentive in a way that looked polite but felt rehearsed. Emily sat quietly across the table, her eyes moving carefully from one face to another. The room had grown very still. Outside the windows, the last light of the evening hovered over the harbor, turning the water into a deep shade of silver. Daniel cleared his throat lightly and folded his hands on the table. "I think that is a very good idea, Mom," he said with a confident tone. "These things are easier when everyone is on the same page." Rachel nodded beside him. "Exactly," she added gently. "Planning ahead avoids confusion later." I listened without interrupting. The food on the table remained untouched for the moment, the warm bread and roasted vegetables filling the room with a quiet, familiar scent. I took a sip of water and set the glass down carefully. "Your father believed that clarity was important," I said calmly. Daniel nodded immediately. "Yes, and that is exactly what we should focus on," he replied. "The lake house alone has increased a lot in value over the past few years. It might make sense to sell it while the market is strong." Rachel glanced toward him with approval before speaking. "And maintaining a property like that can become a burden," she said in a thoughtful voice. "It might be easier for everyone if the assets were simplified." Emily shifted slightly in her chair, but remained silent. I noticed the way Daniel leaned forward now, his confidence growing as the conversation moved exactly where he expected. "Of course you would always be taken care of, Mom," he continued quickly. "We could make sure you have everything you need while the rest of the estate is handled properly." I allowed a moment of silence before answering. "Handled properly," I repeated softly. Daniel nodded again, completely certain of himself. Rachel took a small sip of wine, watching me with careful interest. "Yes," she said. "Your father worked very hard for everything he built. It would be a shame for those assets to just sit unused." I looked down at the table for a moment, noticing the small details that had been part of our family dinners for years. The blue border on the plates, the reflection of the dining room light in the silverware. When I finally looked up again, my voice remained calm and steady. "Your father did work very hard," I said, "and he spent a great deal of time deciding how those things should be protected." Daniel's expression shifted slightly, though the confident smile remained. "Well, that is exactly why we should make some updates," he replied quickly. "Times change, Mom. I reached beside my chair and placed a small folder on the table. The sound of the paper touching the wood was quiet but clear. Rachel's eyes moved to it immediately. Daniel looked at the folder with the casual curiosity of someone who believes he already understands what is inside. Before anything changes, I said gently, there is something you both should understand about the way your father organized his estate. The room grew even quieter than before. Emily leaned forward slightly, her attention fixed on the folder resting between us. Daniel sat back in his chair again, still relaxed, still confident. All right, he said with an easy laugh. Let us hear it. I opened the folder slowly and turned the first page toward them. Your father believed that inheritance should reward respect, I said. Not pressure. Rachel's fingers tightened slightly around her glass, though she did not speak. Daniel leaned forward to read the page, his smile beginning to fade as his eyes moved across the paragraph written in precise legal language. I folded my hands together calmly while he finished reading. Outside the windows the harbor had grown dark, and the steady rhythm of the tide continued moving beneath the night sky. Daniel's eyes moved slowly across the page as the meaning of the words settled in. The confident smile he had been wearing all evening faded little by little, replaced by an expression I had not seen on his face in many years. Rachel leaned closer to read over his shoulder, her posture suddenly tense in a way that was impossible to hide. The room remained completely quiet except for the faint ticking of the hallway clock and the distant sound of water moving against the docks down at the harbor. Daniel finished reading and looked up at me with confusion mixed with disbelief. What is this supposed to mean? He asked, his voice no longer as steady as before. I kept my hands folded calmly on the table. It means exactly what it says, I replied. Rachel straightened in her chair and glanced quickly from Daniel to me. This clause cannot be serious, she said carefully. It sounds very unusual. I nodded slightly. Your father believed unusual situations required very clear instructions, I said. Daniel pushed the page back toward me, as if the words themselves were something he wanted distance from. Mom, this is just legal language, he said quickly. Surely it does not apply to anything we said. I watched him quietly for a moment before answering. The clause is very specific, I explained. If any heir attempts to pressure, humiliate, or manipulate me in order to gain control of the estate, that heir immediately forfeits their inheritance. Emily remained silent, though her eyes moved between Daniel and Rachel as the weight of the sentence settled across the table. Rachel's fingers tightened slightly around the stem of her wine glass. No one here is pressuring you, she said, her voice now more cautious than confident. We were simply discussing practical decisions. I tilted my head slightly and met her gaze. At my birthday dinner 2 nights ago, I said gently, Daniel raised a toast to the old lady who refuses to let go of her husband's money. Daniel shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable now. I told you that was a joke, he said quickly. I gave a small nod. Yes, I replied. You did say that. The silence that followed was heavier than anything spoken earlier that evening. Daniel looked down, again at the page, reading the paragraph once more as if hoping it would somehow change. Rachel leaned closer and whispered something to him that I could not quite hear, but the tension in her voice was obvious. Emily remained still, her expression thoughtful but calm. After a long moment, Daniel finally spoke again. So what are you saying? He asked quietly. I reached forward and closed the folder with a soft but definite sound. Your father believed that inheritance should reflect character, I said. Respect was always more important to him than money. Daniel's shoulders dropped slightly as the realization reached him. You cannot be serious, he murmured. I looked at him with the same calm patience George once showed when explaining something important. The clause has already been reviewed by Harold Benson, I said. The conditions have been met. Rachel stared at me now, her expression no longer controlled. Then who receives the estate? She asked sharply before Daniel could respond. I turned my gaze toward Emily, who sat quietly across the table, still holding her folded hands near her plate. She looked surprised when she noticed everyone's attention shift toward her. Your grandfather believed kindness should never be overlooked, I said gently. He also believed that patience reveals who people truly are. Emily's eyes widened slightly, but she did not speak. Daniel leaned back in his chair slowly, the last of his earlier confidence gone. Outside the windows the harbor was completely dark now, the water moving quietly beneath the distant lights of the marina. I lifted my glass of water and looked once more around the table where my family sat in thoughtful silence. "Your father always loved family dinners," I said softly. "He believed they were the best place for people to remember who they really are." Then I took a small sip of water while the steady rhythm of the tide continued beyond the windows, patient as ever. This emotional narrative explores a powerful moment within a family where a devoted mother faces an uncomfortable truth during what should have been a joyful birthday celebration. When her son publicly mocks her during dinner about holding onto her late husband's estate, the quiet strength of a mother begins to reveal a deeper story about dignity, patience, and the meaning of inheritance. Through reflective memories of her marriage, careful conversations with her granddaughter, and a calm meeting with the family lawyer, the mother gradually uncovers the true intentions behind her son and daughter-in-law's sudden interest in the family property. The story unfolds slowly and thoughtfully, capturing the quiet emotional tension that often lives inside family stories where respect and entitlement collide. As the evening gatherings continue, and the family sits down again to discuss the future of the estate, the mother reveals that her late husband had prepared a legal clause designed to protect her from pressure or humiliation, proving that wisdom and patience can reshape the outcome of difficult family stories. The daughter-in-law's polite suggestions about selling the property and simplifying assets reveal hidden motives, while the son's confidence fades as he realizes that character, not greed, determines who inherits the family legacy. This moving narrative reflects how family stories often carry deeper lessons about loyalty, respect, and the quiet strength of those who refuse to be manipulated. The presence of a compassionate granddaughter reminds us that kindness still exists even when tension grows between generations. Through calm words, thoughtful preparation, and the steady guidance of the family lawyer, the mother allows the truth to surface naturally, showing that family stories are not only about conflict, but also about wisdom passed down through time. Ultimately, the inheritance shifts toward the person who showed patience and compassion rather than ambition, reminding viewers that the most meaningful family stories are the ones where dignity is protected and respect becomes the true legacy. Character 1 is an 86-year-old white American elderly mother with calm, dignified expression. Front-facing portrait. Natural lighting. Realistic elderly woman with silver hair and simple, elegant cardigan. Authentic skin texture and age lines. No cartoon. No cartoon. No CGI. No illustration. Character 2 is a 58-year-old white American man with confident but tense expression. Front-facing portrait. Short, neatly styled hair. Wearing a modern business jacket and collared shirt. Realistic skin texture. No cartoon. No cartoon. No CGI. No illustration. Inside a dimly lit family dining room overlooking a quiet harbor at night, a tense confrontation unfolds between an elderly white mother and her middle-aged white son. The 86-year-old mother sits upright at the head of a wooden dining table with calm, dignified expression, silver hair neatly styled, and simple, elegant cardigan. Across from her, the 58-year-old son stands leaning forward with a strained, conflicted expression, wearing a business jacket and collared shirt. A folder of legal documents lies open between them on the table, reflecting warm light from a hanging lamp. The son looks down at the papers with disbelief, while the mother watches him steadily with quiet authority. The room feels heavy with silence and emotional tension. Through a large window behind them, dark harbor water reflects distant marina lights, creating cinematic contrast between warm interior light and cool night outside. Their body language communicates confrontation without aggression. Realistic lighting. Natural human expressions. Authentic textures of age on the mother's face and tension in the son's posture. No cartoon. No cartoon. No cartoon. No cartoon. No CGI. No illustration. Photorealistic cinematic drama scene. 1-2.